Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is David Ottlinger. David, could you introduce yourself?
My name is David Ottlinger. I write at the Electric Agora, which is fearlessly led by Dan Kaufman, who is known to our audience, and we're here to talk about comic book movies.
Yeah, so you approached me with the idea for this conversation, so I'm gonna let you largely lead the way. Why did you want to talk about comic book movies, and what is the particular angle that we're going to be taking in this conversation? Because I know there's people out there who detest comic book movies and are sick of the fact that grown adults are talking about comic book movies on the esteemed Talking Heads website. But I enjoy them, even though there's parts of them where I think everyone kind of agrees they're repetitive and they're too long, and they are.
All stories are repetitive.
Yeah,
but
they're based on things that were written for children in the 1960s, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so but what is the reason you want to talk about comic book characters and movies today?
Well, particularly, we're going to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Marvel Universe as a whole. I want to talk about it basically because I'm in mourning. I think I just needed a venue to emote. I'm worried.
You're mourning because the Avengers Endgame movie, which came out like 2 months ago, was like the culmination of this cycle in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Or are you mourning Stan Lee's death, which happened about 6 months ago?
No, not so. Although it's funny that he has the great man's habit of dying at the right moment. But more than that, two things happened. The one, as you mentioned, was this big, long cycle of movies, which was, I believe, over 12 years. Was it 2008 was Iron Man?
I think that's right.
And involved over 20 movies, finally came to a conclusion, and is now being wrapped up, and we're kind of all wondering where it'll go next. And at the same time, there was this conflict of corporate interest which arose, because a whole lot of people are looking at Netflix's success and wanting to get in on the streaming game. And one of those is Disney, which is, of course, a corporate juggernaut, and which owns Marvel. It's been buying up properties in the Lex Trump era, and combining itself and becoming this huge conglomerate.
I think the purchase of Marvel was initiated in the Obama era, but yeah, there's been people who are calling for like antitrust regulation in this sector, because I think I just heard a statistic yesterday that Disney will now be releasing like 1/3 of all like major studio pictures, which is kind of incredible.
So it's been buying up properties in the lax Obama-Trump era, which is, not all that different for purposes of corporate consolidation. Mm-hmm. But we've been on this trend for a long time. But anyways, we don't want to talk about corporate consolidation. But Disney owns Marvel. That's the big thing. And now Disney sees itself as a competitor of Netflix. And all the TV shows, which were great, by the way, and I've watched every single season of all the TV shows, were all on Netflix. So they all got canceled and wrapped up there, which just happened to be a thing because of this new Disney Plus streaming service is going to come in. So the shows are all ending, and this big cycle of movies is ending, and it just happens to be right at the same time. And it sort of has me looking back at what Marvel's done. And, I often think as a culture, we don't tell stories as well as we should. The fact that the whole kind of Alex Kurtzman, Robert Orci um, writing team. The fact that something like Transformers 2 gets served up to us as a story with a straight face. The fact that Star Trek Into the Deep, or whatever it was called, I don't care, that this is what we're offered when the studios come together and put a lot of money and put what they see as their best talent together, and that's what they come up with. I mean, that should be offensive to all of us. And like all Star Wars fans, I just feel like Kathleen Kennedy just like took my dog behind the shed and just shot it. It's just depressing. And there have been various attempts to copy the Marvel formula to do a big series of interconnected movies. They've all failed spectacularly. Star Wars is one of those, which ended up being a huge problem because they paid $4 billion for it, and then Solo flopped, and it was a really big loser, and it's been, not been commanding the same kind of critical respect. Marvel really was a venue that they kept serving up good stories and interesting. It was everything that the attempt to make the Star Wars movies and the Star Trek movies into big franchises was not. It was patient, it was thoughtful, it was extremely culturally relevant, it was politically relevant. And over all those years, I never got bored, and that was really impressive. And, remember when Boyhood came out, and the big thing was it took 12 years to make?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this took 12 years to make, and it was like 20-plus movies and like 8 seasons of television. So how much more impressive is that? So, I just want to sing my little hymn of praise to it. So that, Aryeh, is why I approached you.
Yeah, I want to take a slight detour because you mentioned Transformers, and I don't know if I've ever actually discussed
I mentioned Transformers
on here.
in my burning hatred for it.
Okay, so so the original Transformers was like the first pop culture love of my life. I was born in '83, and Transformers started coming out '84, '85, but it kind of continued until roughly '90 or so. And the toys were what I really, really loved. And and I always thought, like, as a kid, they kind of didn't, or when I was old enough to like kind of compare properties in the creative universe, I always thought they didn't really get that much respect. And then and then when they made the first Transformers movie, it was kind of like, this is crazy. This is the thing that I like loved as like a 6-year-old, and now 20 or 25 years later, it's on the big screen. The first one actually is okay. It's decent. It's like a B movie. Not B, I mean B both in the like the classic term B movie, but also like B minus. Like, it's watchable. There's funny parts. It's enjoyable. And then the second one was really awful, and I didn't watch any of it, even though it was it holds a special place in my heart, and I actually still wear a baseball cap that has an Autobot symbol on it. I didn't even watch any of the other ones because they were so bad. They did actually kind of semi-reboot it in the past 6 months with this movie, Bumblebee. Did you see that?
No. I was well off the train.
Okay, it's good. Like, it is legitimately a good movie. You don't need to care about Transformers. It's essentially, they took the E.T. template and swapped the gender of the main character, made her older, and then it's a robot instead of an alien. But it's I found it an affecting movie, both because I like love these characters, in my deepest heart, and also just like they did a good job. So it's, they're always rebooting these things. There have been 3 different actors playing Spider-Man since the year 2000. So it's possible they may reboot the Transformers franchise and, use this as a basis, like going back to the actual characters, what they actually looked like in the original designs and the actual storylines instead of like Michael Bay's nonsense. So I hold out hope for Transformers. But Transformers actually was a Marvel property in some respects, has a weird corporate history. Marvel writers created the mythology and the storyline of the series and named all the characters, which were these toys that came from a Japanese company called Takara. So that's actually part of why I think Transformers has a resonance, because it was imbued with the Marvel spirit. It was a Marvel comic for some time, and then it also was like a cartoon and a movie. But yeah, so there was like something like the company that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby made famous, like has this special like alchemical creative spark in it that I think helps differentiate it from some of these other things. But okay, so back to the Marvel universe.
Well, could I make just a comment on what you just said?
Sure.
Because for the most part, I didn't know about Marvel and their creating mythology, but for the most part, Transformers was a commercial for toys.
Right.
Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a commercial for toys.
Well, Ninja Turtles was a comic originally that was a parody of X-Men.
Yeah.
So it also had this like previous incarnation, and but then it was turned into.
But that was completely forgotten.
Yeah.
And then it was just turned into a commercial for toys. But yeah, the original I understand had more of an adult audience, and then the more popular incarnation was the one that was really aimed at little kids like me in the early '90s.
Yeah, I was a Turtle fan from the early '90s as well.
Sure, and that just means when they start making films, it's more or less a blank slate, which can be good and can be bad, depending on the person you're starting with. But with Marvel, what they're tapping into is something that's just a book. It's just stories, something that lived and died on its storytelling. And there's a long, rich well there. And when you look at why did this succeed, why did Marvel succeed when Sony, I think it was Sony's attempt to take the old like James Whale horror movies from the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, the Universal monsters, Frankenstein and
why did that
Invisible
fail?
Man and Mummy.
Well, they weren't tapping into that sort of deep well of storytelling that Marvel is and can. And when they are, they're taking the source material seriously. Because like the attempt to go back to Star Trek, they just hollowed out those characters, Bones and Kirk and Spock and what made them work and why they were friends. And they just ignored the storytelling. And the other quick thing I wanted to say is if you look at, so I'm going to reference my favorite YouTubers again, Red Letter Media, because they made a great point about the way Kurtzman and Orsi write storytellers, which is connect the dots. They care about where they're going. They don't care about how they get there. They don't really care about narrative. They care about having a scene where two guys fight on top of a train. Who are the two guys? Why are they fighting on top of the train? How did they get into the top of the train? Doesn't really matter so long as we can get those two guys on top of a train fighting. And the rest is just kind of connect the dots. Transformers 2, I'm sorry to fixate, but it could honestly be said in a philosophical sense that it's not a story. Like the different characters, objects, and motivations are so obscure, so nonsensical that you just can't follow it, and you're not supposed to. I mean, it's really, and that troubles me because storytelling is such an important dimension of human life. And what we're doing, living our lives day to day, is telling a story about ourselves. So this kind of exercise in storytelling, I take it's very ethically serious. Mm-hmm. And when we can't do any better than that, I think it's a very serious thing.
Yeah. So Kurtzman and Orsi, they rebooted the Transformers, and then did they do the Star Trek reboot also?
Yes, and they did the Amazing Spider-Man, aka the one that nobody likes.
The second iteration of Spider-Man, right? Which I can't remember if I actually saw either of those. They filmed weirdly. They filmed part of that in Rochester, New York, where I live, and I went and kind of watched them. They closed out some streets because there's a small part of Rochester's downtown that looks like Manhattan, and they filmed an action scene there. And I did not see Spider-Man, but I saw people milling about. But anyway, so yeah, that's interesting.
A really quick thing. Uh, the big showdown at the end of Anchorman 2 takes place in a little park that happens to be in Atlanta, where a lot of things are shot. That's that just happens to be right in front of the building where at the time the GSU philosophy department was. So it's a park I'd been in 1,000 times.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, wait, no, it's a mind-blowing experience. Go ahead.
But that's interesting that, yeah, these two guys who seem to be kind of mediocre, but they're able to, continually pump out these movies that make money, or they wouldn't keep on getting the deals. The way you were talking about it, we have character, we have plot, we have storytelling. In the old Transformers, it was a 22-minute cartoon, so, not very well animated, but actually it had the voice acting was very good, and the guy who voiced Megatron, the main villain, is this guy, Frank Welker. And he is one of the most talented voiceover artists of all time, and he does mainly animal voices. So you still see him credited when they need a cat to meow, or a dog to talk or something. I think he did Scooby. I think he was the voice of Scooby Doo. And the guy who did Optimus Prime, the main hero, is this guy Peter Cullen, who just has a majestic voice that makes you feel like the good guy is here and he is going to take care of business. So it was, and then you had the toy, so you could hold the character and have some actual relationship with it. And then, yeah, but a lot of the plots it was the same thing. The good guys fighting the bad guys. They wanted Energon, blah blah. That part didn't really matter, and for a 6-year-old that didn't really care.
Fine.
So then
that's where you have to start, right?
Yeah. So then taking it to this world of CGI interacting with actual humans, and then a 2-hour movie, you need more than just these characters. And I'm thinking, actually, I was just yesterday listening to the Slate Culture Gabfest podcast talk about the Lion King remake, reboot, whatever it is.
Right.
And they all essentially said the same thing, which is the CGI is so good, it looks so real, that it just seems to be this dead world that has no actual life in it.
You don't know? Do you know about the Uncanny Valley?
But it's almost beyond the Uncanny Valley. It's it looks real. When they're not talking, it looks like a real lion or whatever walking along the savannah. But comparing it to the expressiveness or liveliness that existed in the original hand-drawn animation, something major was lost. And you're and the way I haven't seen it yet, but the way they were describing it was why? Yeah, when you see the lion talking and it's in a super realistic way, there's just something alienating about it. And I'm thinking about all these properties that have been rebooted. They're, except for a couple Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, they're not animated. They're live action with CGI, and it's in what? So in most comic book movies, it's mostly actual humans walking around. In Transformers, it's the giant robots only exist in CGI form. And then sometimes there's characters, fully animated characters Groot or Rocket Raccoon in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. And then it's what do you, where do you enter the Uncanny Valley? Where do you enter the fact that that these beings don't actually exist, and you're trying to suspend disbelief, versus just a cartoon or a comic book where it doesn't matter that it looks kind of janky, but you can still relate to it, or Lion King, which is a masterpiece of hand-drawn cell animation, and universally beloved, and I loved it when I was a little kid. So maybe there's part of it is related to this issue of form, and go ahead.
Sorry, every time I hear the phrase suspension of disbelief, I have to do a brief spiel. Because if you go back and look at Samuel Taylor Coleridge's original essay, he actually meant something pretty specific by it. He did not mean that you believe what you're seeing is actually happening. And he thought that was a wrong way to view art. He tells a story where he was looking at a lithographic sketch of a ship in a storm that eventually sank. and he thought it was a very good lithograph, and he was talking to a friend about it, and his little son came in the room, and his little son was asking about it, and when Coleridge explained it to him, he said, the young son said, "All those poor people drowned." And Coleridge said, whatever his son was viewing it incorrectly. He was viewing it like he was really standing there looking at a sinking ship, right? He wasn't viewing it as a work of art. And so I always have to say that, because it's important to think that way about the way we watch stories. If I love King Lear, if watching King Lear was actually like going through the process of watching somebody lose all of his children, it would be so traumatic. I would never want to watch it again, and I would need years of therapy from seeing it once. But what she said about effects becoming so realistic that you forget about them, I felt that way about Thanos. And what was great about Thanos is I wasn't thinking, the whole time he was on screen, I was not thinking, what a cool big purple guy effect. I was thinking, man, Josh Brolin's a really good actor. So I was just thinking, that's Josh Brolin. And so when the effects disappear, that could be a beautiful thing if you have a good story to tell. Mm-hmm. I will prophesy here, even with Macbeth and Hamlet written into the bones of it, they will not tell a good story with the new Lion King movie. So the effects will disappear, and there won't be much to fill that void, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, when
George Lucas years ago said an effect without a story is a very boring thing, or something very close to that. That's a good point. Sorry. Please.
Yeah, I mean, so the Lion King, getting back to that example, is a fairly simple story. It's sort of like Hamlet, and but it's part of a genre which we understand that we're watching, things that were painted and animals are talking to each other, and everyone growing up watches animal cartoons or whatever, or here's these storybooks where animals are talking to each other.
Goes all the way back to Aesop, right?
Yes. So that's deeply ingrained. But then maybe I guess if a small child is viewing The Lion King, they may think like this is actually happening in front of them, or it's happening somewhere else, or they're really, really sad when spoiler alert, Mufasa dies, because they're sad that this beloved character has died. But then I don't know. There's the adult, or even the older child who knows that this is like not really happening in front of them. It's a cartoon. Still feels the emotion, obviously. And then getting back to Coleridge's time, we didn't have like the painting was not photorealistic. Stage productions were obviously much different than they are today. And what it wasn't a sense of realism on the stage. I once had a conversation. Actually, it's funny you mentioned Lear. I think I've mentioned this before, but I once I audited a class in college with Harold Bloom, the renowned Shakespeare scholar, and he was talking about how he thought he had never seen a production of Hamlet or Lear that was satisfying, and because he thought maybe it was unproducible. It would be be like
that's a very 19th century opinion.
Well, he's an old-fashioned kind of critic, and so I actually asked him. I went up to him after class, and the only like one-on-one conversation I had with him, and I said well, Shakespeare, we know he like wrote for money, famously, mm-hmm. And he was part of a troupe, and they wanted to make money through their productions, and like so what how could he write unproducible play? And he essentially said the 16th early 17th century stage productions are totally they can't be reproduced in our era, and we can't understand what they were like. I think he said, they were screamers. And they weren't trying to give a, production imitation of human life in the way that we understand, like, what theater should do today. It was maybe more like a cartoon or, like a Punch and Judy show or something. So that was the only answer he had. But yeah, it is hard to stage either of those plays because they're both like very long, and it's hard to get
a lot of characters.
Yeah, but so it's like, what are we expecting out of these things in some sense, if you watch a Shakespeare's play, like, it's not real life, because they're talking in a weird language and like they're
And
standing.
there are fairies and witches and
Yeah,
ghosts.
all sorts of weird shit is going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
hang on.
but then, okay. So then, getting back to our main topic of like the Marvel movies, we know this isn't real, and I think that's the objection that I think some kind of grumpy people have to these movies. It's like they're wearing tights, they're wearing capes, they're flying through the air, they're shooting laser beams out of their eyes. Like, this is nonsense.
Well,
this is child stuff. So what do you say to that?
Well, you can't wave Shakespeare in front of me. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Shakespeare guy. So,
well, I am as well. But this is a Marvel conversation.
No.
But
Quickly, I took a course with David Bevington, and so I think I win in that comparison because I think Harold Bloom was always overblown. But thanks to Grenville Parker, David Bevington, and a myriad of other people in the 20th century, we can see much more that they are performance pieces and really made for the stage. So I think the 20th century pushback on the 19th century idea that those plays are unperformable has been very effective. But actually, I'm glad you brought up Shakespeare because there was a thing I wanted to say about Marvel and Shakespeare. Because I loved Marvel. As a young boy reading Shakespeare, it seemed to me part of and reading Homer at the same time, what drew me in was it seemed like that kind of storytelling didn't exist anymore. That kind of really heightened, last night of all, when yon same star that's westward from the pole made its course to heaven to loom that place where now it burns. Basically, all he said is last night at this time, but he deliberately said it in the most elaborate way possible. Horatio says to Claudius, he's been asked what he wants, and he said, my liege, your grace and pardon to return to France, from whence though willingly I came to do my duty in your coronation, yet now I find my thoughts and duties bend me back towards France and to your gracious leave and pardon, which all he says is, I'd like to go to France, please. But he says it in the most elaborate way possible because he's talking to a king. And you say things in the most elaborate way possible when talking to a king. That deliberate heightening is something we don't really do much anymore. Marvel actually kind of does that, and actually it's there's an archness to it, there's a good and evil to it, there's self-consciously heroic and self-consciously villainous. Shakespeare is famous for having prating, boasting villains who boast and rant about their own villainy and how very proud of how bad they are. We get a bit of that in Marvel too, and actually people who were Shakespeare actors have had real success in the role, starting and in comic book movies in general, going back to Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in the X-Men movies, and Brian Cox in X-Men 2.
Yeah.
One of the things I've said is to be a good comic book villain, you have to be able to give the St. Crispin's Day speech. The famous purple passage from Henry V, where Henry rouses the troops with this long oration about we band of brothers, yes. Where and as an actor, you have to stand up there and very seriously give this very elaborate, very Elizabethan speech, and take yourself seriously while doing it. You don't want the hardest audience is a bunch of middle schoolers who want to snicker, right? And you have to keep them from snickering. You have to really be that king and say, no, I'm up to the gravity. This is worthy of iambic pentameter and these elaborate rhetorical devices. And we get that kind of storytelling in Marvel, and that's a part of what I love about it. And that didn't seem to exist too much before. Except, all right, so more back on plan here. I remember when you're a little older than I am, but when we were kids, in particularly like 80, let's call it 87 to maybe 2000. It's what kind of movies were they making when they wanted to make a lot of money, when they wanted to really get a hit out there? And it seemed to me they're actually often on a kind of small scale. Some of the um, the models that were on offer there. There were the films of John Woo. There was things like I forget the director's name, but he did Predator and Die Hard, which
Hmm.
became big hits, which were small scale action movies, um, but very tense, a lot of action, very commercially successful. Look at something like Jurassic Park or Terminator 2, which I remember as being great big blockbusters from when I was young.
Yeah.
I mean, Jurassic Park is in a way an incredibly ambitious movie in terms of technical effects and
Yeah, I mean,
push.
it was the first big CGI movie blockbuster. There were some movies that used CGI before, but this was the
Right.
first breakout. I actually saw it in theaters a year or two ago. It holds up very well. It is
Yeah,
still a great movie.
people always talk about the effects still look great
Yeah,
too.
the effects look good. I mean, you can tell in some parts, but also
Yeah.
just it's Spielberg. Like he knows what he's doing, and he has a great cast.
Right, Spielberg. E.T. is also a movie in this
Yeah.
period. Um, but when you think about the story of Jurassic Park, it's a handful of people who are trapped in this park and they have to get out. And in that sense, it's actually pretty small scale. It's just this handful of people who happened to be there when things went wrong, right? So as a young boy, I love those movies. I still love those movies. But I looked back at old movies like Ben-Hur, Ten Commandments, and the old Cecil B. DeMille epics. And there was a kind of smallness in comparison. You know, Jurassic Park, for all its merits, didn't have the kind of scope and sweep of the old Cecil B. DeMille movies. Um, and I noticed a real change when Peter Jackson started doing the Lord of the Rings movies. And this is part of why the Lord of the Rings movies worked so well, and the Hobbit movies didn't so much. Is they were a story about that whole world. It was about the whole world of Middle Earth was involved in this big conflict, and that was partly a moral, celestial, theological kind of conflict as well. And I thought that was a real innovation, and that kind of brought back an older kind of storytelling that we weren't really seeing before then.
Mhm.
And I think that did a lot to inform Marvel. Because at the end of Marvel and Infinity War and Endgame, they're also telling a story about the whole world they live in, not just a handful of people. There's nobody living in the universe of Marvel who could have ignored what happened, right?
Hmm.
And that strikes me as a real achievement. And they're to be applauded for their ambition in telling those kinds of stories. And, there's a kind of reflecting of the fact that the movies seem to be the last place where we tell stories all together, where it feels like everybody watches these big movies. When we talk about like Game of Thrones, which is bad, and I explained why it was bad in an
We
article.
can link to that essay,
Yeah,
but I will
Game
not.
of
We will
Thrones.
not take up that issue in this conversation.
No, we'll just accept it as fact that Game of Thrones is bad. But or any other like Breaking Bad, or when that was a big thing, or Mad Men, for instance. It's when it gets talked about on Twitter and articles are written and blah blah blah. It feels like I'm only talking with like other 5%ers, the sort of more elite audience.
Yeah, both those were premium cable shows that
Right.
never probably got more than 5 million people per episode viewing them.
Mhm.
Game of Thrones obviously is a premium cable show because it's on HBO, but it did break through, I think, in a way that most of these high-end TV shows haven't, for various reasons. So let me respond. I want to briefly. I had an idea pop into my head, and I'm pulling this out of my ass, so we don't need to think about it any further. But you mentioned Homer and Shakespeare, and then we have Marvel Comics and DC Comics, and I think it's possible to maybe view DC as the analog to Homer. These iconic characters who don't really have psychological depth, but more like have a single thing that they're about, and they are larger than life. So DC is Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Batman are the four main characters, and then Marvel had these, famously had these more psychologically complex, ambiguous characters, where sometimes maybe the villain had a better argument than the hero, and the characters were flawed and they were a bickering family, as in Fantastic Four, or someone who had made a huge mistake in his life, like Spider-Man, by letting the robber run free who later killed his beloved Uncle Ben. So that's the Shakespearean psychological depth, I think, is an analog for the Marvel characters in some ways. But what you're talking about in terms of scale and epic, so you had the old Ten Commandments, kind of Gone with the Wind, Ben-Hur, these old Hollywood epics, and then that style of filmmaking, and also like the ability to do that in terms of how the power of the studios faded, and then you had Star Wars would be the counterexample to what you're saying, because that's clearly an epic, and started in the late 70s and went on through the 80s, and had different worlds, literally, different kinds of characters, different moods, different had comic parts, it had dramatic parts, action scenes, love scenes, all that packed in, and that has carried over to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think I discussed this, I think, in the conversation I had with Jeet here, which we'll link to after Stan Lee died. A key to this, so this shared idea of a shared universe is a key to the success, financial success and creative success of the Marvel Universe, because you feel like you have to see them all, because there's little bits revealed in each one telling an overarching story. They had this from the beginning, when the very end, when they had the post-credit sequence in Iron Man, where they find Thor's hammer at the very end, and you realize, oh my god, there's going to be a Thor movie after this. But this idea of a shared universe was something that was there in the Marvel comics from the beginning of the early 60s, whereas Superman lived in Metropolis, and Batman lived in Gotham. Most of the Marvel characters lived in New York City, and it was portrayed in realistic fashion, even though you had these superheroes flying around and the Baxter Building skyscraper where the Fantastic Four lived, and the Avengers compound. But yeah, they would have crossovers, and it was I'm sure Stan Lee did not invent this idea, and I'm sure there was a Batman and Superman crossover before this, but Spider-Man would visit the Fantastic Four, and then if you're a fan of Spider-Man, you had to buy the Fantastic Four issue also to get the story, and so that's smart marketing, but also you're creating this huge universe. All these characters are interacting. They have a huge backstory. When I got into comic books, in the late 80s, early 90s, you could get these issues that summarized the past issues, and I got these issues. I was really into X-Men, and I got these issues that summarized every single X-Men comic, from number 1 to number 300, which was around where it was in the early 90s. And I read them for some reason to get the a capsule summary of what had happened to my beloved X-Men characters. And yeah, it felt like you're falling into this world and could be a part of it. I mean, they've changed it. The comic itself, I kind of stopped reading comics in the late 90s, but they changed the way they do it. They rebooted them all, so they all start at issue number 1, because it's kind of forbidding to a person who's coming in from the outside to pick up this thing that says it's number 426. So they're constantly rebooting it with number 1, and then they change, the characters are always shifting around, and it's a new storyline. But then, I mean, what's kind of great about the form and lends it to all these different forms of adaptation is like, yeah, you always can like start over again, even though somehow Captain America fought in World War II, and he's still around, and his friends are still around from back then. It's early, some of them. You sense that it you can just start over and take the core idea, which is in almost all these characters a really good idea for a character, and put a new twist on it, and then like the little kid who's 8 years old can get into it at that point, and still share something with like his dad who was reading it in the 70s or whatever. So that I think that's like a really cool part of this world and the way it's unfolded, and maybe yeah. So then you have, I mean, I'm sure that helped with the financial success in the movies, is that you had people who read Iron Man in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, taking their little kids who just wanted to see a cool action movie, and everyone loved it. So it's a it is an important cultural artistic achievement that they've done this thing repeatedly. They made like 22 or so movies. Almost all of them are good. A couple stinkers in there, but for the most part, they're all like just enjoyable movies you can watch.
Yeah, I was never a comic book person, but I know that comic book people are used to this kind of storytelling, this big interconnected tableau, very wide tableau with all these different characters and stories going on. I was experiencing that for the first time, and it felt like we got that out of these stories. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing. I don't know what to compare it to. It's such a wide, vast tableau. You got into this a little bit in your Endgame video, but I don't know what in storytelling uses such a wide canvas where, like I said, actually, I didn't see all the movies, and actually one of the kind of underpraised elements of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that you can do that. You can skip movies and not be lost.
It's like a soap opera in that aspect. Like if you just started watching Days of Our Lives today, they would fill you in kind of on what was happening before, and then after a few episodes, like you're in the story and you just want to keep on going. So there's the serialized aspect, the fact that these comic books came out monthly, originally, and they wanted you, sometimes it would end on a cliffhanger, and sometimes the story would end, but then you could, maybe step away for a little bit and then pick it up again, and you'll kind of be flowing.
Yeah, like I never saw the Thor movies because they pretty much all got bad reviews, and I don't care that much about that character, so I skipped them, and I was fine. There were a couple lines where they were talking about Natalie Portman, and I was like, I don't know who that is, but I was fine, and that's great. And
Thor 2, I think, is the worst of in the entire run, and I've seen all of them except the Hulk, which got bad reviews also. But it's funny, they I don't know if you saw the announcement. Natalie Portman is coming back, and in Thor 4, she's going to be female Thor, which is a character they came up with in the comics at some point in the past 15 years that like either Thor turns into a woman or she picks up the hammer and has the powers. So they're always doing that kind of stuff in the comics. This one, Captain America is now this person over here is the Captain America, and then maybe it'll go back, maybe it won't. So this, and that's what they're seemingly doing in the comics with War Machine. No, what is his character's name? It's some kind of bird character. Nighthawk or something. That character is seemingly Captain America gives him the shield at the end, and he's going to take the mantle of Captain America. So Falcon, the character's called. So that kind of you have these core characters, iconic, mythological in the case of Thor, literally, or then just kind of iconic in Captain America, and then it's like, there's a black Captain America. Like they did that in the comics, like in the 80s, I think. So that this is not like a new like woke PC thing to mess around with this kind of stuff. And someone else is leading the X-Men now. Oh, it's Magneto is leading the X-Men now. It's something else is happening. So they're always using this kind of crazy gimmicky stuff. But then sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and then it just It just goes on.
As somebody who watched the TV shows a lot, which were in the same
The
world.
cartoons.
No, no, no. The live
Oh,
action
okay, yeah, the
Netflix
Netflix
TV
stuff. Yeah.
shows. Yeah, like so at the end of the first Avengers movie, there's a big fight that happens in the middle of New York. And that affects the world and the politics in all the TV shows. And they refer to it as the event.
Right.
And it makes them, it makes like powered people, as they generally call them, superheroes, of like a political issue that like people on CNN are talking about. And so that and that affects the lives of our characters on the TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not a gimmick. It felt real. Even while I could dip in and out, I'll say the one time I was lost was Civil War, and I'm pretty sure that's why they made it officially a Captain America movie.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of an Avengers movie, which all the critics are like, this is the next Avengers movie. Why did they call it Captain America? I think they called it Captain America 3 because like you had to see all the Captain America movies to kind of get everything that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that scale was pretty hard to beat. And the Defenders was flawed, but I think pretty wonderful in a lot of ways, where they set up these 5 different characters with shows of their own, and then they all got together in one show.
Yeah, I didn't watch that. Maybe I watched the first episode because I skipped Iron Fist because it got really bad reviews.
It's good. It's good. I'm here to tell you it's good. It's
and then it seemed like Iron Fist was core to the Defender stuff, so that I think I watched the first episode and didn't continue past that.
Oh yeah, the first episode's actually not very good, but no, I'm a defender of Iron Fist because it got panned for being Orientalist,
Mm-hmm.
which it is. Like it does have a very naive, from a Western perspective, mythologized kind of view of the Orient, if you like.
Yeah, it's core to the character, which was like invented in the 70s, and yeah, it's a white guy, goes to the Far East or something and learns the secret powers, but then he gets is it actually his fist? I can't remember. Is it a magic glove?
Yes, yes, no, it's actually his fist. But it's actually, I mean, look, we understand it's pretend. We have these arguments sometimes about, because the old kind of Fu Manchu idea of the Orient shows up sometimes in Sherlock Holmes. There was a new episode of Sherlock that dipped into that because that was a part of the milieu in which the original Sherlock Holmes lived, and sometimes it shows up in Doctor Who. And I think we can all be adults and see the fake version of Asia and differentiate it from the real world of Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just make that little leap and get into the Iron Fist story, it's actually a really good story. And yeah, I commend it to you. But the other thing I wanted to say was, getting back to the feeling in the 80s and 90s that there was a kind of smallness to even the biggest stories we were telling. I mean, I think what we might have just seen now with Infinity War and Endgame was, it might be the crest of the wave in terms of event filmmaking and trying to tell these massive sort of stories in order to bring people into the theater. A lot of people look back at, you mentioned Gone with the Wind and Ben-Hur. At the time, those felt kind of unbeaten. But what really happened is and Dan made a great comment about this, is that with film being threatened by so many competitors, it had to go really hard into the things that only film could do, things that were appropriate to the big screen, big action spectacles, which were, you wanted to see up there on the biggest possible, viewing. And this sort of may be it as far as the massive spectacle that, under threat, it went back to sort of the basics and the things, or film as an art form went back to the things that made it unique. And, it may never get bigger than this. And I think that's a really interesting moment. And we should all, I might be wrong, but if not, we should all sort of take a moment to reflect on it as it passes us by.
Yeah, I'm trying, the final battle scene in the last Avengers movie, is some sort of, human pinnacle in terms of, probably thousands and thousands of people were working to get this thing to look like it was actually happening. You had 50 recognizable famous actors participating in it, and they're each on screen for 3 seconds because so much was happening. I don't know if it's the best action scene, but it, all sorts of crazy stuff was happening constantly. The part where it was kind of they were passing the gauntlet between all these different people, the part where all the female Marvel characters somehow magically all assembled in a line at the same point to stand off, and everyone clapped in my theater when that happened. Just all
I
sorts
didn't notice that, by the way.
Oh, really? That's funny. It was almost, I thought it was almost like a too on the nose moment that they put in there for fan service, which is something that people accuse the Marvel movies of. So I don't so what could they do to top it? Have 100 brand name actors, throw Brad Pitt in there and Leo and Kate, Kate Winslet and everyone else we could possibly think of to put Tom Cruise in a fighter jet also. I don't know what else we could do to top it. But then it is I don't know, were you paying attention to any of the news coming out of Comic-Con?
A little bit, not too much. Yeah.
I think they announced, I think it's 2021 or 2022, there will be 7 Marvel movies in that year, and I think they only named a couple of them. Some are still mysteries. So they want, they want to make money. They have this intellectual property, and they know, people love the brand at this point, so people are going to keep coming. So it's interesting what are they going to try to continue this sort of group storytelling thing, connected stories, or not? Or was it just too complicated? Some of the actors are they're doing Thor 4, and the guy who plays Thor, I can't remember his name, is sticking around. Some of the spoiler alert, Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. is gone. I don't think we're going to see Cap again. And some of these other characters are fading away, but they're moving all these different platforms. The Disney Plus thing, they're going to be, I think they had at least half a dozen different series. The Hawkeye series, a Wanda Maximoff, and the Vision series. And, so some of the name brand people are going to be involved in just this thing that I guess is Disney's version of Netflix, and you have to subscribe to pay for it to see. So, they're going to keep pumping these out. Will the public reach a point of exhaustion with these things? Because like you said, Solo was kind of a flop, although I'm sure it made at least $100 million. But despite the fact that Star Wars is beloved, that did poorly enough that they canceled the Boba Fett origin story film and so forth.
They've been pretty smart, and from the announcements that have been made, it looks like they're going to scale it down for a while, which seems smart. There's one thing they did that was really smart, and which caught my notice. After they did a really big movie, after they did Avengers, they would generally put out a small movie. It's so I think was it after Avengers they did the first Ant-Man?
Possibly, possibly, and that's literally a small movie because the character shrinks down to the size of an ant or even smaller. And that's yeah, and that was like in different tones. Also, that was a
Right.
primarily a comic movie and a silly
Right.
one, even though it had action and stuff. And yeah, so they're not all like exactly they're not all cookie cutters of each other.
No.
Like the Captain Marvel also had a fair amount of comic business going on with the like being back in the mid '90s and stuff like that. So yeah, and they're giving them. I mean, the other interesting thing, and I mean, part of the success is they're not giving them. They're giving them to interesting directors to play with. So the guy who has now taken over the Thor franchise, his like previous, he was he's this guy from New Zealand, I think, and I think his last name is Watiti or something, and he just gave a totally different like spin on it. It was visually, it was very unusual looking. It looked like a crazy kind of almost like David Bowie 70s outer space thing, and yeah, so he's taking it in different directions, and then they bring in auteurs sometimes to do these, and then people
James Gunn being the quintessential.
Yeah, he was like
example.
a niche kind of like horror movie guy, and so he took over Guardians of the Galaxy, and everyone loved those, or at least the first one. So yeah, so they're not just whereas the like with DC, they're just like either giving it to Zack Snyder or making it kind of look like Zack Snyder. Although with Wonder Woman, that was different. They gave it to a woman's name I can't remember right now, but she definitely was.
Was it Patty Jenkins?
That might be right. So she did not just copy the janky Zack Snyder style in that one.
No.
But yeah, so
and it was a good movie.
Yeah, that was a good one. And then giving it to Ryan Coogler to do Black Panther was not like a super obvious choice either. And that one was very good as well. So yes, so I think they'll probably they seem to have there's this guy who's I don't know how you say his last name. It's like Fahey or Phage or something. Who's the executive?
Fuji, I think.
Something like that. Feige, I think. And he's the executive in charge of all this stuff at Marvel Disney. And yeah, he seems like he knows what he knows what he's doing. And I don't know. At this point, we should probably put our trust in the corporate overlords at this point. What we're getting towards an hour, but we can go a little bit longer. Do you want to talk about cynicism? That was one of the things you had marked down that you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I want to focus particularly on the whole thing was they're putting superheroes in a fairly realistic world and giving them fairly realistic sort of problems. I thought the whole Captain America arc was really interesting. There's a great line in the first Avengers movie where he's talking about what he's going to wear, and one of the SHIELD agents wants him to wear his old costume. And he's like, the stars and bars, isn't that kind of old-fashioned? And he says, I think people could use a little old-fashioned right now, which was a very interesting dynamic. And, Captain America represents this sort of idealized view of American citizenship. He was a skinny guy who wanted to go to war to serve his country. And he ends up kind of facing down a government that betrays a lot of those ideals. And that's the story that they end up telling with Captain America, which is very, very interesting. And Infinity War was kind of the peak of this kind of, I think Infinity War was some of the most interesting filmmaking I've seen in a long time. And sort of representing the anxieties of this period. Because the beginning of Infinity War, it's not quite the first line, but it was the first line I heard distinctly when I was in the theater the first time. And I kept my ears open for it the second time. The first thing I heard is, "We are under assault." And Thanos' first line, Thanos being the big villain, he turns around and says, "I know what it is to lose." That's our introduction. And that sets out the whole theme of the movie. And it's thematically extremely consistent. It's about losing. Wanda loses Vision. There's all kinds of different loss and different situations. Peter loses Gamora. Thanos loses Gamora. But at the end, we are so used by the tropes of comic book storytelling for our heroes to defeat the bad guy at the end of the movie. It's the thing that's supposed to happen. And at the end, it doesn't. They lose.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've said spoilers, I guess. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this movie came out over a year ago, so I think it's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Spoilers.
Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just to finish this, one of the most interesting moments in film was the moment after Thanos kills half the life in the universe, because all of our heroes just sort of slump to the ground, and they just sort of sit there wallowing in defeat, and they're just sort of staring blank-eyed in amazement at the fact that they lost. And that's the whole first act of the next movie, was just sitting back and like, wow, we can lose. And I think that's kind of how America's feeling about itself right now. Because we've won a lot of things. We got very used to winning whatever fight we're in. You can look at the Vietnam War, et cetera.
Telling ourselves at least that we won, whether or not we actually did.
But I think more now we're kind of confronting the fact that we can lose, and there might be something out there bigger and stronger than us, and we're not always going to prevail in the end. And that was a really fascinating moment. Now, you had a comment?
Yeah, I think it's, that, like, I'm trying to think, was there a previous superhero movie that ended with the good guy losing and the bad guy winning? I can't immediately think of one. Maybe there is one, but the good guy wins in the end. That's what we come to know from superhero movies. Mm-hmm. And then so it was certainly an audacious choice to have this giant spectacle blockbuster superhero movie end with all of our heroes losing and half of them disintegrating into dust in front of our eyes, and the villain winning. And then, usually at the end of superhero movies, the score is like da 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 da, and there's like, and that's the end. There's the credits, and it just went away into blackness, and then like this, the actors' names started appearing on the screen for the credits, and you left that feeling like, holy shit, they really did it. But then I've said this before in the episode I did with Milton Lawson about the second Avengers or the fourth Avengers, for you, the cynical part of your mind reminded you, oh wait, the Black Panther movie just made $1 billion. They have a Spider-Man franchise. They can't actually do it. It's all gonna, somehow it's all gonna come out okay. They're gonna have to reverse it. They'll go back in time. They'll spin the Earth around backwards, like in the Superman movie. So they have a plan to get out of this mess somehow, and they mostly did. Some of the beloved characters died, But yeah, I mean, I think really it was audacious to make that creative choice to end the movie with Thanos seemingly victorious. And then it was equally interesting that the first, 30 or 45 minutes of Endgame was like, Captain America in a grief support group, and you just seeing seeing the memorials that were created to all the people who got blinked out of existence. So that was very interesting. They didn't have to do that.
The grief support group. I think what's going on there, it sounded like in your previous conversation on Endgame, you thought that was a support group for people who went through the Thanos snapping experience. I don't think that's true. I think he's like in a VFW. I think it's for soldiers, which is what the captain is. And they just happen to end up talking about this because it's something they all went through. But, you do kind of take it that way in the movie, because all they talk about in the therapy session is living through Thanos's snapping and all the people disappearing. They call it like the vanishing or something. And then that's an interesting reflection, because it's like the whole world is in therapy, which is an interesting cultural reflection in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, if you imagine if this actually happened and they play out what it would kind of be like, everyone who was left would know someone close to them who just disappeared. Yeah, so it would be like a global trauma that everyone shared. And if we think about like how people reacted and the country reacted after 9/11, with instead of 3,000 people dying, like 3 or 4 billion people seemingly dying, disappearing forever, you could think like how, what would happen? Would the government fall apart? I mean, they should, if it's not post-apocalyptic, it seems like things are still functioning, but like, there's all these abandoned cars on the road, and they clearly haven't like gotten things like running back to normal. So I think I said this in the previous conversation. You can imagine like fan fiction or something being written about what is happening during this period. Like, you don't even need to involve the heroes. Like, you could just think like, how would people actually react to this? What would happen in the government?
But can I respond to your one point about they bring everybody back? Because I really like the resolution that they did find. You did know that in some sense they're going to get everybody back, but they brought them back in a way that they were absent for 5 years, and then they came back.
Yeah.
So they left everybody with that 5 years of trauma and going through the feeling that everybody was going to be gone. So it wasn't just a simple wiping away the slate.
Yes.
They left that deep wound there.
Yeah,
and I thought that was
it wasn't
really
Superman
smart.
Flying backwards, reversing the spin of the Earth to get
that's
Lois
too
not to fall.
DC.
Exactly. Yeah, that's too simple. That's right. Did you see the recent Spider-Man movie?
I haven't yet. No.
It's pretty good, but it's very much like they're not ignoring what happened. Like they have to explain somehow how Peter is still in high school, and it's like, all the kids who are gone have to pick up their sophomore year or whatever they were in.
That's what I was thinking at the end of the movie when he walks in and sees his friend in high school. And
so all the best friend and the love interest, Mary Jane, are all got zapped away. But they riff on it in funny ways. Like they show a kid who was like, when the snap happened, he was like a nerdy kid, and then 5 years later, everyone came back and he's like a hunk. So they're all like super interested in him. So they kind of play with it in that way and are not ignoring it, but also continuing to tell like new stories that aren't directly affected by it. They go to Europe for some reason. I don't know exactly why they go to Europe, but they go to Europe and have like adventures there. But yeah, I mean, they're gonna keep churning these things out for the foreseeable future, and maybe past the foreseeable future, because they make money and the intellectual property is strong and people love the characters. I mean, it's interesting that the new part of it is there's this weird intellectual property history of the characters. So like Fantastic Four, the rights were with a different company, and Spider-Man, the rights were with a different company, and X-Men as well. So they've reabsorbed Spider-Man from Sony, I think. And then they, which I think is actually why that Into the Spider-Verse movie was made. Because I think Sony still had the animation rights. There's all these weird like things to think about that,
Well, Spider-Man was rescued from Orsi and Kurtzman.
Right. So that was the Sony version, and then the new version with, I think Tom Holland is the name of the actor, is within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But then they're bringing, I think they want to bring X-Men in because that was 20th Century Fox, which Disney owns as well. So they could
just acquired,
yeah. So X-Men was the thing I was most into as a kid. It was the most popular characters through the 80s and 90s, and then Avengers became more popular as they started making these movies about them. And some of the X-Men movies are good, some were not so good. I didn't even see the most recent one because it got really awful reviews. But they could reboot that once again with either some of the same actors or new actors entirely. They put Wolverine on the Avengers in the comic books at one point, so they could do that if they want a popular character to join the gang. And
no, well, I hope not, because spoilers again, but his death was spectacular. So
Well, they'll bring a new,
Okay.
they'll bring a new one in. I mean, it's part of there was a running joke in like comic fandom that, no one comes back to life. Or sorry, no one is dead. They always come back
Mhm,
to life.
mhm.
The only people who stay dead are Uncle Ben and Bucky. And I think they brought Uncle Ben and Bucky both back. So it's like if you're dead, they'll bring it back because that's the logic of comic book world. Um,
Can I make my brief spiel about the last Jessica Jones? I'll keep it short.
Sure. So Jessica Jones is one of the Netflix series, and it's kind
Yeah.
of a. I actually read towards. It came out towards the end of my time reading comics, and the original
Uh-huh.
comic is really really good, and it's a take on the private investigator genre, but the private
One of my,
investigator is a former a superhero who has stopped being a superhero but still has powers.
one of my favorite tropes because it connects everything to the old German expressionism and the old hard-boiled detective films of the 40s, which we get some great noirish music in the Jessica Jones series. But the last season came out after Endgame, and I'm pretty sure it's like the last, uh, the last Marvel. Well, there's the Spider-Man movie too, which may have come out after, but it's like the last. To me, it's like one of the last things of this Marvel era. This last season of Jessica Jones, and it's a perfect swan song. I mean, it just couldn't be any better. It's a fantastic season, and like I said earlier, they generally refer to superheroes as powered because they felt a little queasy in this realistic world using the word superhero. In this last season, they used the word superhero early and often, and it's about heroes and about heroism. And without spoiling it, there are a whole bunch of people, some of them very good, some of them very, very bad, and some of them who are right in the middle, but they all find ways to think of themselves as heroes. And one of the things it's grappling with is people can do horrible, horrible things and think of themselves as heroes of their own story the whole time. But it's not totally cynical. And again, I'm not going to spoil, but at the end, I think there's a sense that even knowing all the moral ambiguity in the real world and all the dangers of power, it is possible to do heroic things and even to know who the real heroes are and if you're a hero yourself. And that was a really important, non-cynical note to end on. For all the anxieties and the moral anxieties and the feeling of we don't know who the good guys and bad guys are, they really ended on a note where even in a very dirty world, being moral and doing good things and being virtuous is possible. And I thought that was a really exciting, important story to tell.
Yeah. I only watched the first season of it, which was really really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, David Tennant is the villain, and he has the power to if he speaks to you or you see him and he tells you what to do, you have to do it, no matter
Mm-hmm.
what it is.
Or you automatically do it. You just can't resist his
Yes.
commands.
So if he tells you jump out the window, you will jump out the window.
Immediately without hesitation.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very like twisted idea, but it also has these real world like analogs about abuse and figures in authority abusing their power and like sexual abuse. And then the star is Kristen Ritter. Is that her name?
Yeah.
So she's very good, and but I got sidetracked and never continued past
Yeah.
the first season.
You didn't find out who the villain was in the second season, did you?
No.
That's a great moment.
Okay. And yeah, I remember the comic being really. I mean, this was like This is like 20 years ago that I read this, but it's by this guy Brian Michael Bendis who became much more popular after this kind of stuff came out, and he wrote all the flagship for both Marvel and DC, I think. And it's also the art is really really cool. It's done in this very like moody style with like dark tones, and it's not like the normal comic book art. but then you find out that she was an Avenger once, and then you see the flashback ones, and they used a different artist who was a very
Oh, really?
conventional comic book style artist with conventional comic book style coloring of bright colors, that kind of stuff, to show the flashback. So it looks like this was an actual, like issue of Avengers from the 90s, even though this was like a newly created character who they were like retroactive continuity retconning into the thing, saying she was like an Avenger you never heard about. So it was kind of had this meta aspect as well that, they were playing with the form and stuff. So I think they've, a lot of the stuff from that era, are in, graphic novel, like collected form that you can either buy or like find a local library. So I think it's called Jessica Jones. They had a sequel and it had a different name that I can't remember right now, but, yeah, I would recommend that. And the first arc is that story with the David Tennant villain.
The Purple Man?
Yeah, he has purple skin in the comics,
Right.
not just like a purple tie or whatever. So yeah, I would recommend that, even if you're not like a super comic book person. It's a really well done. Is there anything else you want to hit, or should we wrap up here?
No, that's what I wanted to end on, is that wonderful, important note that being good is still possible. and because I see a society that's grown very cynical about the possibility of virtue. And then that's infected a lot of our culture. And a lot of my political work, in my writing and stuff, has been decrying that, which is why I like the mindful resistance, and why I like the Niskanen Center's attempt to revive republicanism. And in our storytelling life, this is a great kind of bright spot of people looking, at the world, warts and all, and fighting back against that kind of cynical instinct. And I think it's pretty damn important.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what makes Marvel work is that you do have idealism and heroism, but there is also the cynicism and sarcasm built into it. Like, the original conception of Superman was just like, this is the greatest guy ever. He can do every possible thing: strong, fly, shoot laser beams, run really fast.
And Metropolis, as the name implies, sounds like an abstraction.
Yeah, he lives in a city that is run perfectly and everything's great. And then, Batman is a darker character, but even still, it's kind of like there's, kind of one main part. The Flash, he can run really fast. Like that's all he can do. Whereas,
Batman
they are
lives
kind of idealized characters, whereas the Marvel ones, more complex. Spider-Man hates himself. Peter Parker hates himself because in his real life, not only did he inadvertently cause his beloved uncle's death, he is a loser. He can't get the girl. He's always messing up, and the jocks are beating him up in the hallway and this kind of stuff. So it's not just like the perfect thing. They are these shaded characters and are more and interesting. I think that's why they're more successful. For both in comic book world and movie world.
You keep me out of your comic book nerd fight.
DC versus Marvel is the like original comic book nerd thing, and but they both have their partisans, and there's people who love Batman and love Superman, and the characters became more complicated as time went on. But I was always a Marvel kid from the beginning, and the American cinema-going public has decided that Marvel is more worthy of their dollars right now than the other ones. Although I watched Aquaman on DVD, and it was better than I thought it would be. It was okay.
That's what I've heard.
I fell asleep during the first viewing and had to like rewatch the last hour, but it was.
That's not a rave review.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't like recommend it exactly. But if you have any interest, it's goofy, and if you just kind of want to see it, if you want to see Nicole Kidman doing karate, like fighting and stuff like that, get it on DVD or whatever. But the Marvel is where it's at right now, and probably will be for the foreseeable future. Okay, so David, thanks for coming on. Thanks for proposing this idea of something to talk about. I hope no one comments about how two adult men should not be spending an hour of their time talking about comic book movies because, this is like the culture of our era, and it's worth paying attention to, I think. And yeah, so
if anybody wants to comment that, I'll compete with them on Shakespeare any day. So.
yes, I mean you were quoting lines from Shakespeare, so yeah, there's culture in this as well. We mentioned Spider-Man, we mentioned Harold Bloom, so Howard Stark, Harold Bloom, they're all here. Okay, let's end it there. Thank you, David. Thank you, viewers and listeners. We'll see you again next time.